Hi, joining me today is Karen Wong, who has her own YouTube channel called The Meaning Code, and she interviewed me recently for that about my story. And she's very graciously agreed to join me today to share her story. And you're also an artist, Karen. So really it's to talk about what brought you to where you are today and doing what you're doing today. But it's lovely to see you and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's a great privilege to be here. And it's always nice to tell one's story. You know, there's not very many people who are willing to listen to your story, especially when you get to a certain age.
Well, I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
So it's a lovely gift to be able to tell my story. And I think it's a lovely gift to be able to tell my story, especially since, and so I'm kind of giving things away, but I lost both my parents when I was 40 and my first husband at the same time to a divorce, which we'll get to. But that meant that whole first part of my life, up until I was 40, I don't have anybody to share those memories with at all. Nobody remembers my life during that period of time. And that's a very strange thing about the way memory works. I think you have to have people to kind of talk about the old days with, you know, like, oh, remember when we did such and such. And so it's a great privilege to be here and to be able to talk about these things. So I grew up the daughter of a military family. My dad was in the Army. He was a career guy. And he actually went into the Army when he was 16 years old. He lied about his age. So that would have been 1933 because he was born in 1917. So he joined the cavalry, which back in those days, they actually rode horses in the military. And then, so I have to tell the story how my parents got married, because I think this is really fascinating. My mother was working, I think at that time she was working as a teller in a bank in Minneapolis. And she was 27 years old, which in those days would have been classified as an old maid.
Wow.
Not because she hadn't had other suitors. She just wasn't interested at that time. And she was living with a woman. She was rooming in a rooming house in Minneapolis. And that woman's son came home on leave from the Army in 1942, which is right in the middle of the war. That was my dad. But they met. He dated her twice during that week. And then he said, I have to go home and talk to my parents about something, and then I'll be back. And he went and he came back. I mean, he had his dad and mother were separated. So he wanted to go talk to his dad. So he came back and he proposed and they got married the next day.
Wow.
So they knew each other 7 days before they got married. And she said, then he went back to the military base in Colorado. And when she went to join him 3 months later, she couldn't even remember what he looked like.
Oh.
Those were crazy years during the war years. So that wasn't a very good start for a marriage. They didn't have very much in common. They had no foundation. They had no faith. And as a result, they had a very rocky, contentious marriage for a number of reasons. So I grew up in this very contentious, angry, backbiting family. And my father particularly had a problem with alcohol. He's what you call a 5 o'clock alcoholic. Mm-hmm. He was always very diligent to go to work and do his work in the military. But when he'd get home at 5 o'clock, whatever he was trying to forget, he would forget it in a bottle of whiskey. And he never really talked about the war years, but I have a feeling that there was some of that he was trying to drown. And so I never had what you'd call any sort of a relationship with my dad, but my mother was a very loving, kind person, but she was understandably under a lot of pressure and anxiety because of the situation with my dad's alcoholism.
And sorry, Karen, where did you come in the family? Were you the firstborn?
Oh, no. I had an older brother, 5 years older than me. He was born in 1943. And then I came five years later. So the war was already over when I was born. And at that time, my dad got posted to work as a military instructor at the university in Alaska. So I was born in Alaska. And then we moved back to the States 8 months later. So I have no memories of Alaska at all. I was an infant at the time. We moved to Minnesota for a short while, and then Colorado. And then when I was 4, my dad went over to Germany to a posting to help with the reconstruction after the war. And he was there for a year without the family. And then we joined him a year later. And some things happened during that time that ended up making my parents' marriage. I think probably it wasn't as contentious when I was a toddler, but that separation for a year created a lot of distance between them. So by the time we got to Europe, things got really bad. So my memory of my childhood, I used to say that I have this one memory of my childhood of looking through a wine glass, because there was always liquor around the house. And so somehow I remember seeing the room through this wine glass filled with red wine. And it was either that or it was bottles of beer on the table in the bar where my parents would drag me when they'd go drinking. And but I didn't know there was anything weird about that. I mean, to me, that was just what life was. And it was just life that parents only fought with each other and didn't have conversations. And it was only life that I never really got any guidance from either one of my parents. I think my mother would have liked to have been more a part of my life, but she just had all her own problems. But she was a great cook and very loving person. And she was always, she was the kind of person that people would follow her home just to talk to her, because she would really listen to people and really talk to them. But she could never really be there like that for me until I was a young adult. So my childhood was kind of strange. And as a result, I think I ended up as like the caretaker child, because my brother he was kind of doing his own life. He was very, very, very active, very sports minded, very intelligent, very popular. He was really good looking. He looked like Elvis. And at that time, of course, that was the big thing. So, and I was 5 years younger, so he didn't really want to have anything to do with me. So I just kind of read. I mean, I read lots and lots of books. I probably read 7 or 8 science fiction books every week. I'd go to the library and come home with a big stack, and then I would just plow through them during the week. And I did very well in school because I had nothing else to do,
Yeah. So you said you had no guidance. You felt you had no guidance. You had no moral guidance. You just felt directionless, would you say?
I think one of the strange things is that when you grow up in a sort of a traumatic household, you don't have a lot of memories. I just have little memories here and there of things that happened. And my biggest memory is that I just was sort of going along in a fog all the time, because I didn't really have, Jordan Peterson talked one time about people that are kind of in a fog because they don't really know who they are. They haven't figured out, they haven't put the pieces together in their life to figure out who they are. So I knew I needed to be respectful of authority, or I was going to get into big trouble. So that much I knew. You want to stay away from getting whacked for whatever. And so I learned to kind of toe the line and be very respectful of authority. And that was part of why I think I worked so hard in school, because I wanted to make my teachers happy. Yeah. Not because I had any goals for myself. But then when I got in high school, I got into choir, and I just loved music. And so I sang, I was in the band, I played lots of instruments in the band. I started out on the saxophone and ended up on the clarinet, and then later the saxophone, and then the bass fiddle and the timpanis. And I mean, I did all kinds of stuff in music. So I wanted to go into music in college. And the one person who was really kind to me was my choir director. His name was Dave Thomas, and he was a wonderful man. And he was a Lutheran, and his family was very involved with the Lutheran church. And so they invited any of us that are in the choir to come and sing in the Lutheran church choir. So I went and did that. In order to do that, I had to go through the Lutheran Catechism because they wouldn't let you sing in the choir unless you had done their catechism. So I learned this whole catechism, but none of it made any sense to me. I was just spouting words.
You had no Christian upbringing.
No. I had no church, no Christian upbringing, no nothing. But I went and took this catechism because I had to, and they talked about things like transubstantiation and consubstantiation. And to me, they were just words. I had no idea what they were talking about. And the other thing was that in those days on Wednesday afternoons, they had what was called release time. So you would get out of school a little bit early, and then you'd go to your chosen church and take catechism classes. And the school kind of supported this. Well, I didn't have a church, so this was before the choir thing. I picked the Methodist church, and so I went there, and because you'd get out of school early to do this, right? And there they taught me about John Wesley and Charles Wesley and all, but I don't ever remember hearing about Jesus. And so I never learned anything during all this time. I just got all this kind of, I guess you'd call it theology, but maybe it wasn't theology. It's just some kind of dogma that didn't speak to my heart. But it could very well be that because I was just dumb and directionless and wasn't open. I have no idea. I can't really recollect what it was that they said, but it didn't make much sense to me. So I wanted to go to college, and my choir director had graduated from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. So I thought, well, that's where I want to go to college because I want to be like him. So I went away to school there for a semester, but I had no idea how expensive it was, and I had no money from my parents. I had a scholarship that covered the first semester. And at the end of that, I couldn't figure out what to do. So I went home to my family. And by that time, they had moved to another town. So they were close to the University of Minnesota. So I matriculated at the University of Minnesota, which was very cheap. Got a couple of part-time jobs and paid my way there for a couple of semesters. And then my parents moved to Bloomington, Illinois. So I followed them down there because at least if I had room and board, I could get a job and pay my own tuition. So I went to Illinois State University down there for a year. Then my father was in a horrendous accident when he was unloading a forklift loader from a truck. He sold large equipment. So he was unloading this big forklift loader, backing down the ramp from a truck, and the ramp broke. And the forklift loader came over, and he hit the ground, and the forklift loader landed on top of him. And he was hospitalized for, I want to say, 3 or 4 months in a coma. And then later when he came out of the coma, he had something called aphasia.
Yeah.
You familiar with that?
A little bit, yeah.
So his words were all confused. He would say things, and he knew he had a meaning to what he said, but the words were all jumbled up, so they had no meaning to anybody who listened to them. So it was a very strange thing to see how our cognition works, that things have to be kind of wired up right, or we can't really communicate with each other.
Yeah. And you were how old at this time, Karen?
Well, let's see, I probably 18, 19. I graduated from high school when I was 16.
Yeah.
Because I skipped second grade when I was a kid. So then that made me socially awkward a little bit because I was always a year younger than everybody else.
Right.
And I was very chubby in school. And so I was always getting humiliated and ridiculed by people. So I have a heart for kids that get humiliated.
Yeah.
You know, I think bullying is one of those very strange things. Jordan Peterson often talks about bullying as actually having a kind of a purpose, because it keeps us a little bit lined up with what normal life is, you know, as we outsource our sanity to other people.
Yeah.
But and I can certainly see where some of my backbone got built during that time.
Oh, yeah.
But I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. It can give you a certain resilience that
Yeah.
after the event you think, well, that's strengthened me, but
Yeah.
during is very unpleasant. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you watch it happening to your children, you would do anything that
Yeah.
you possibly could to stop it from happening, right?
Yeah. Gosh.
Yeah.
So, but you did you have a small group of friends? Did you feel completely alone?
That's a really good question, because I didn't really have, so we moved around a lot in the military, and then we lived overseas. We lived in Germany and then Italy and many different homes. And then we came back to the States and lived in New York. And then we moved to North Dakota for a little while. And then we landed in Minnesota. And at that point I was 9. Right. So we had done all those things before I was 9. Gosh. And so I'm in 5th grade at that point in this small town in Minnesota. And I stuck out like a sore thumb, because I come in, you know, this little town has been here. All these people have been here their whole lives, and they all know each other, and they didn't know me. And I talked funny because I had been all these different places. So I had a strange accent. And I don't know how much effect that had on me, but I know I didn't have any friends. And then one day when I was in 7th grade, I was out playing on the tennis court, just hitting the tennis ball around. And this girl from my class came up to me. Her name was Charlene. And she said, "I'd like to be your friend."
Nice.
And I didn't think about it at the time how weird that was, but it's really very weird. But at the same time, it was completely a lifesaver for me. I think if it hadn't been for her, I would have ended up being one of these emo kids wearing black and
yeah,
cutting myself and tattoos and all that kind of stuff, you know. But she in a way, she rescued me, but it was never like she was rescuing me. She was really an authentic friend, and we did everything together. Yeah. We wrote books together. We listened to Ricky Nelson albums together. Wow. We had all our dreams and goals together for the future. And she really helped write my life, I think.
Wow. And as a Christian now, do you look back? I know we're going to come to your journey of faith, but do you sort of see God's hand in that, bringing her into your life at that time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think a part of her reaching out to me may have been an aspect of her faith, because I found out years later that although she wasn't really what you would call close to the Lord at that time, she was a Lutheran, and she had been baptized as an infant in the Lutheran Church. And years later, when I spoke to her, maybe when she was 25 or 30 years old, she said that she had had a regeneration in her Christian life at that point that had kind of renewed her faith. And then I realized that her faith had kind of been there her whole life. She'd grown up in a Christian family, or a family that at least put an emphasis on moral behavior and kindness and things like this. And so I got accepted into her family. You know, we'd go over there and play games, or they'd get the ice cream out of the freezer, and everybody'd sit around and have a bowl of ice cream in the evening. And it all seemed quite magical to me that families did things together like that, because my family wasn't like that. And so
so that was a little glimpse for you of perhaps more ordinary, perhaps family life. And this came at the same time that your dad was recovering from an accident, or was this earlier?
Well, no, this
was earlier,
way before. I mean, we kind of got our time scales.
We did. Yeah, no, that's fine.
So we're back in junior high and high school now. When I had this friendship with Charlene.
Yeah.
So jumping back to when I was 19, from there, I followed my family up to North Dakota, where his brother lived. My dad's brother lived there, and so he could spend time recuperating where there was some family around. And probably within a year, he was completely back to normal. I mean, he made an amazing recovery, and he was able to go back to working and have a normal life after that. But that's what landed me in North Dakota.
Yeah.
Where I went to North Dakota State University. At the time, it was North Dakota State Teachers College. Wait a minute. Dickinson State University. At that time, it was Dickinson State Teachers College. And that's where I graduated from college. That's where I met my first husband. One of the things that we liked to do was buy old houses and fix them up. And we did quite a lot of that in our early years. And I had my first daughter when I lived in North Dakota. And then my husband wanted to have a hobby farm. And so we started looking for land. But in North Dakota, they would pretty much only sell you 160 acres at a pop. And we just didn't have that kind of money. So we looked around, we found a 50-acre spot in Iowa and bought a little hobby farm there and raised ducks and chickens and geese and rabbits and cows and pigs, and
nice.
Had quite an adventure there for a number of years until that house burned down in the middle of the night and we escaped with our lives. And
gosh.
So,
and can I jump back, Karen, to you said you met your first husband when you were in North Dakota at college, and your mum and dad had known each other for 7 days and then got married. Was it a bit longer for you with your first husband? Did you know each other very well before you got married?
Oh, wow. You know how to dig into stuff, don't you?
You don't have to say anything you don't want to say.
Well, it's okay. He and I were good friends. And then we were kind of in the same study group. And then those were kind of crazy years because that was during the hippie years. And so for some reason, he was gone for a semester, I was gone. And then when we came back to school, we got to talking and just thought, well, what would it have been like if we had actually started dating? And so we started thinking about it and sort of fell in love in front of the fireplace one night talking about this. But in the meantime, while he had been gone during that semester, he had gotten engaged to a woman out in Seattle or Portland. So here he is now. He wants to marry me, but he's still engaged to this woman. So he had a 53 Chevy. And so he took his 53 Chevy. He had left his 53 Chevy out there because he was going to go back there and marry her. So he had to go pick up his car. So he took the train out to Portland and to pick up his car and to break it off with her. Right. Unfortunately, in the process, during the time that he's on the train going out there to meet her, the announcement of their engagement got printed in the newspaper.
Oh, how unfortunate.
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, I felt very bad for her. But so in the end, he broke it off with her. He came back with his 53 Chevy and we started dating in earnest. And we were probably dating or sort of engaged for almost a year. And some things happened. I mean, it's a long story. He ended up going off to Seattle.
Yeah.
And kind of breaking it off. And I was so crazy in love with him that it didn't really matter what happened to me. So I just completely humbled myself one day at the end of the first quarter of school. I got on a train. I went out to Seattle. I said, I don't care if you even want to say hi to me. I just have to be near you.
Yeah.
I was shameless, really shameless. And so I showed up there in Seattle and he came to the train to pick me up and told me he loved me and, we were going to get married. So we got married that year on December 20th, which we got married in the Catholic Church.
Because he was Catholic?
He was Catholic. He was raised Catholic. He didn't believe the faith. He was raised Catholic. And we had come back to North Dakota to get married. And the church told us that they had to post the Baines for at least 6 weeks before we could get married. And somehow they twisted the rules a little bit and shortened that, because I know we came back after Thanksgiving and we got married December 20th. So something went on there. But in the meantime, we had to take some classes with the Catholic Church where they were teaching us about marriage and stuff. And I do remember those classes being very beneficial.
Yeah, like a preparation course.
Yeah. They talked about how love takes time and commitment, and it was all good stuff, but we did not go to church. We didn't participate in any sort of religious activity or anything like that.
Yeah.
So we got married. We had a baby. A year later, we bought this little hobby farm. We moved to Iowa, pulling cows in the middle of the night because the mama's having trouble having the baby. And so we'd have to reach up in there and get the calf turned around and pull the calf out. I mean, it was quite a life. And then that place burned down. So we had to move. And so about this time, it's like the mid 70s, and the political situation in the country from 76 to 80 was pretty similar to what's happening now in the United States in terms of a lot of turmoil. The economic situation was really bad. There was high inflation. And I had never been very interested in anything in college, but I got very interested in that problem. And so I started researching history and economics and archaeology and the past and the present, and trying to figure out how these problems had arisen. And I kind of stumbled on a conspiracy theory, which I won't go into. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories, but this one seemed to hold a lot of water, and it really scared me. And I did so much research that I had eventually kind of filled up a whole room in our house with books and papers and documents, documenting all the aspects of this idea of who was kind of controlling things. And one of the things I stumbled onto, which turned out to be absolutely true, was an organization called the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. And the Aspen Institute is one of these elite think tanks, and it's in Aspen, Colorado. And the Aspen Institute had been publishing maybe a monthly journal or something like that. And in one of their journals, they had said something to the effect of, we want to prepare good global citizens for the one world that's coming. Now, mind you, this is 1979, maybe. And they were talking about this one world with all the global citizens, which we see now.
Yeah.
So obviously it was true, right? And they said, we want to prepare good citizens for this. And so we want to have control of the children and their educations.
Right.
I'm thinking, I don't want anybody to have control of my child. That doesn't sound right, you know? And so I remember falling into bed one night, just in tears, saying, I don't know if there's a God out there, but if there's a God out there, you've got to do something about this. I've written letters to the editor, and I've, tried to write op-eds, and I've tried to influence people, and I'm not as big as this thing. This thing is bigger than I am. So if you're out there someplace, you got to do something. That was my prayer.
And you were living, would you say you were living in fear at this time?
Yes, I was
very heavy.
I was very much living. I probably wouldn't have known that was what was happening, but I was obviously very anxious because I'm just reading more and more and more things and trying to, find what's the answer and how do I solve this? And then I just saw it was like so much bigger than I was, especially this humanistic thing. I didn't know what that was, but I knew I didn't like it.
Yeah.
And through a series of events, within just a week or so, I ended up being invited to a church, which was unlike any church I'd ever been to. I'd occasionally been invited to church, but mostly they were dark affairs where you sit in the back and get out as quickly as you can. Yeah. But this church was filled with light and filled with people, and couples were sitting with their arms around each other, and families with children in the pews. And thought, wow, this is a whole new world. And they were singing interesting music, and I still didn't know what they were talking about, but on my way out of church that day, they were giving away free books. And the book was Secular Humanism in the Light of the Holy Scriptures by Homer Duncan. So I thought, wow, I want to read that book because it's talking about humanism. And I knew that that was something I didn't like. So I picked up that book and I took it home and I read it. And it laid out humanism on the one side and the Holy Scriptures on the other side. And I said, well, I obviously don't like this humanism thing, so my answer must be in the Scriptures. And that was when I started trying to understand what this was all about. Then that, like within a week from that time, there was a tent revival in our town. I don't know if you have tent revivals in England.
Tell me what a tent revival is.
Well, they come along, they put up a tent outside of town, they bring in a preacher, and he starts preaching the gospel, and they'll have music, and then they have the gospel, and they have music, and then he'll make a call, you know, anybody who wants to follow Jesus, come forward. And so
it's not something I'm familiar with. It may happen, but I haven't heard of it.
It probably isn't happening now, but for some reason, it was probably an outgrowth of the Billy Graham era.
Yeah.
So because this would have been 1980, and Billy Graham started in the late 50s, but he was still very big back then in the late 70s and early 80s. And so these little towns are probably trying to copy. I can still remember the guy who did the music at this tent revival. I can't remember the preacher. I didn't know what he said. It didn't even make that much sense to me, but I had read that book. And that book said that I wanted Jesus. And so I walked down that aisle and I knelt at the altar. And one of the ladies came over and put her arm around me and prayed for me. None of that made any sense to me, but she invited me to their church. And so I started going to their church, and I started going to Bible studies. And little by little, through the study of God's word, it all began to make sense. And so somewhere in there, I discovered or opened my heart up, or I don't know how you want to put it, but somewhere in there, I realized that I wanted Christ to be my Savior, and not just my Savior, but also the Lord in my life to guide me. And so that was the road that I went. It wasn't one of these instantaneous, oh, the heavens opened up and I saw all this. You know, it was kind of probably a 6-month process.
Yeah.
But it all started when I said, if there's a God out there, you've got to take control of this, because I'm not big enough.
Yeah.
And
then finding God, you were living in fear at this stage with this humanistic, this thing that you'd come across. And then in finding Jesus, was there just this reducing of that fear, the realization that that was not the biggest thing, that this thing that you had feared is not as big as God? And so you can breathe almost, that God's in charge. And
that's a beautiful description of it. Absolutely. And the change in me was so radical that my husband noticed almost immediately, within like 3 weeks of me coming to that decision. My husband said, you know, you're just so different. And so let's go to church together. And so he went to church with me, and that it was a wonderful little church out in the country, and the pastor was a truly wonderful loving Christ follower who had been a missionary to the Navajo Indians for 27 years before he ended up at this little church. And so he knew something of giving your life for others. And so the message that he preached that day that my husband was there was just so perfect. I mean, I felt like every message I heard the first couple of years after I became a Christian was written just for me. It was like, this guy's been following me around. He knows everything about me. But of course, he didn't know anything about me. So it was completely the Holy Spirit just guiding my thoughts, you know. So anyway, my husband also made a commitment to follow Christ at that time. And then our daughter went to summer camp that summer. She was 9. And she made a commitment to follow Christ. So that one summer, the whole family made commitments to follow Christ. And then shortly after that, I was asked if I would run for the state legislature in Iowa. Not connected to the Christianity thing at all, but because I had been so active in political things when I was so anxious, trying to solve problems. And so my husband and I sought the Lord on this, and we felt like he said yes. And so I ran for office and was really miraculously elected, because it was a district where my opponent had 75% of the electorate in a polling, and I had 25%, or at least my party had 25%. He had 75%, my party had 25%. Yeah. So it was really a miracle that I got elected, and I served for 2 years. And I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but that was mostly what I did there was related to education. And one thing I find so fascinating nowadays is people are all stirred up because of this stuff that's happening in education. And I'm like, you guys, this started.
It's been down the line.
At least 40 years ago, right? Yeah. The other day I was on Twitter and somebody was talking about some horrific thing where he was publishing a video which was taken of some teachers in a teacher training thing where they're learning a lot of really disgusting ways to teach young children disgusting things. And I'm like, that is exactly what was happening in 1980 in Iowa. Yeah. And I can tell you, I mean, it's so parallel. It's just very strange. When I was in office, there was federal funding coming through the state education agency to fund sex education, but they called it the parenting education program. And it was being developed by the home economics department at Iowa State University. And here are a few example lessons. I won't go into great detail because it's pretty grotesque, but one of the lessons was to pair the girls and boys up. This is 9th grade. Pair them up, boy, girl, and have them talk over all the dirty words they hear on the playground. And write down the words on a piece of paper and put it in a box. And then the teacher at the front of the room is supposed to pick one of these words out of a box, write it on the board, and then put down the medical term for this behavior, and then describe what this behavior is to the children. And the whole point of the exercise was to desensitize them to any sort of judgment that might be made about these behaviors. And that one of the mothers from another district came to me and she said, because I'm a teacher's aide, I was able to go to this teacher training program for this curriculum. And the teacher's training program had the teachers sitting in a darkened room with a screen in front of them. And on the screen are flashing all these dirty words in fluorescent colors. And then the instructor says, if this makes you feel uncomfortable, and if you can't say these words out loud without feeling uncomfortable, then go home and in your closet and close the door and say them out loud in the closet until you can say them without feeling uncomfortable, because you need to be able to talk about these things without any shame. And then they showed a video called The Quickie of a couple, and the video was sped up. It's a couple going into a motel room, taking off all their clothes, having sex in various positions, and then putting their clothes on and leaving again. So the whole video only takes maybe 2 minutes, but because they speed it up, right?
This is 9th grade.
That's right.
Material. So that would be here.
This was not for the kids to watch. This was to train the teachers so that they would be desensitized, so that they could teach the lessons to the children.
Right. Okay.
Right. So several of my conservative colleagues in the legislature and I put together a packet of these materials to inform the other legislators and to say, let's stop this funding because this is obviously not right. It seemed obvious to us that this was not right.
Yeah.
And we put the materials together into a packet, sealed all the packets, and then we had them distributed to the 100 House members via the pages. The pages were high school interns, high school seniors who had come to work as pages. The pages distribute the packets. The legislators open the packets, and immediately some guy jumps up from his desk with his microphone and he says, "This is disgusting. You shouldn't have material like this being in the hands of pages who are only in high school." And we said, exactly. Yeah, right. But this is being taught in the high schools. Well, but you don't have any right to say that because you're not a teacher and teachers know best. And you can't, the teachers union knows best. And so you're stupid. And so then we tried to have committee meetings to expose this video that was being used. And then I got attacked in the news for showing dirty movies at the legislature. But when we had public hearings about this, it went on to public hearings. Since we had public hearings, the PTA came and testified on behalf of the teachers, on behalf of the NEA, and saying that we had no business sticking our nose in how things were taught at the schools. And at the end of the day, after 3 months of this, of being harangued daily in the news as being, I think one time they called me an archaic anachronism of an ancient age. They called me a bimbo. They called me everything you could imagine.
Gosh, Karen.
Because we were trying to expose this stuff.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we got 13 votes and the other side got 87 votes. Because it was none of our business what was being done in the schools. And obviously the teachers knew best for the children. Oh. And I've only told you the mildest of the lessons. Yeah. There were some of those lessons that I read that honestly, I had to make a concerted effort to wipe them out of my memory bank because it was so troubling to me that I didn't want to carry that stuff around. And that's exactly what's happening today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And it's exactly the same playbook. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank God for you and people like you, Karen, who will try to stand up against this. I want to come back to your journey in just a second, but over here just recently, there was a show that was advertised and was going to be put on in a few local theatres, I think, called the Family Sex Show. And it was for children as young as 4 to come with their parents as a family and watch different characters, some of them, if they felt comfortable taking all their clothes off, they could, and showing different sexual positions and so on. And it's just an absolute outrage that this is normalizing, like you said, this idea that the teachers are in charge and they know best is absolutely utter nonsense. Nobody knows best what's best for their child than their parents. And I spoke to Stephen Rummelsberg last week, and he was saying that there are attempts to separate the child from their family. And that's what a lot of this is. It's to try and get the children comfortable with these things and to take them away from the grip of their family and their family values. It's outrageous.
Well, and see, this had started way back then too, because eventually I started working with a bunch of parent groups. There were excellent parent groups in Arizona at the time that were trying to expose this. And then we had a number of parent groups in Iowa. And the parents would get the textbooks and they would read the textbooks and they would discover that, like in most of the sociology textbooks, there were actually statements like, you can have your own values. You don't have to follow your family's values. You don't have to believe what your parents believe. This is for, like, you know, middle school, right? And then they had things, what they called circling, where the teacher would sit around a circle with the kids and they'd have the kids talk about things that happened in their home. So it kind of like the old Soviet thing, you know, where the children are supposed to tell on their parents, and so that the school teachers would know.
Very similar.
Now, I understand that there are kids that are being abused, and that we have to have ways of knowing about that. But that's not what this was about. This was more about, you know, do your parents have religious ideas that are weird, and you know, and I think at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is do away with any sense of innocence or beauty.
Yeah. But why?
And
what's the aim, do you think, Karen? Why are they trying to do that?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, let me tell you one more story. Because my party was in power at that time. We had the majority. So the committee leaderships were people from my party. So I had the opportunity to be the committee chair of a subcommittee on educational regulations. Now, in Iowa in 1978, before I came into office, there was a law passed that required every teacher to go through annual training in multicultural, non-sexist education. And even at the time, that training was very strange. My husband was a teacher, and so he had to go through this training. And they would have things like, you know, pretend that you're a tree, or lie on the ground and pretend that you're a sponge.
Always useful.
Yeah, it was a values clarification exercise and an opportunity to see the world through other perspectives, because you had to appreciate all cultures and all sexes and be multicultural and non-sexist. And I mean, that's pretty mild compared to where we are now.
Yeah.
But it was an annual requirement. And I think part of it is get people to knuckle under to whatever strange thing it is you want them to do. Just get people obedient, you know, right? Make them willing to accept strange things. It's very 1984, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, because of that multicultural, non-sexist education regulation, that was one of the things I wanted to try to overturn, because I'm a committee chair in 1980. I thought this law is new enough. Maybe I can do something about overturning it.
Yeah.
So I'm exploring that and having testimony from people that are in the Department of Education. So the head of the Department of Education in Iowa comes into my committee meeting, and he's telling me that, well, yes, I mean, all of the curriculum that we develop is developed through the lens of values clarification. I don't know if you're familiar with values clarification. That was a big movement that went on back during that time. The idea is that all values are neutral.
Right.
And everything can be seen through a lens of value. But they don't mean it the way that Jordan Peterson means it. They meant it in a different way. So, for example, if you take a law of physics, the law of physics where or the paradox where an unstoppable movement hits an unmovable object.
Yeah.
So you have a car traveling at high speed hitting a brick wall. The way that law is supposed to be taught in a values clarification perspective is, how did the wall feel?
Right.
Yeah. So what you're doing really is you're getting rid of any sort of technical expertise or any sort of understanding of deep principles and laws and and then one of the Christian teachers that I knew sent me a packet of materials that had been in her recent multicultural non-sexist education training program. In this packet was, for one thing, a list of all the organizations that if a young person felt that they were gay, here's a list of organizations that you can contact where you can find a partner. And they had phone numbers and addresses, and so teachers should make this material available to their students so that they could find, you know, if they were the only gay kid in the school, they could find a partner someplace else.
And how old were these kids? Sorry, they were.
Well, I mean, this was a teacher training program that these teachers, every teacher in the state had to take the multicultural non-sexist education training program. It didn't matter what level you were teaching at. So
right.
I don't know who would have been using those particular materials, but also included in the packet was an article that had been written by somebody that claimed that Jesus and John were homosexual lovers. Oh, and this was to kind of pacify people to think, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with this because, you know, Jesus is our model and he was like that. So I thought this was obviously wrong. And so I made copies of this material and I distributed it to the members of my committee. And I distributed it at the end of the meeting, and I said, at our next meeting, we're going to talk about these materials because these are being used in these training programs, and I think we have to talk about that. And that night, I got in my car and I drove cross state because I had to be there the next morning for a radio show where I was being interviewed. I stayed at my motel. I got up the next morning. I'm at the radio studio at 8 o'clock in the morning, so I hadn't read the news. And I walked into the radio show and the announcer, first question out of his mouth is, what do you think of this news article that just came out this morning? And he puts it in my face. And it's a picture of two gay guys walking down a street holding hands. And the headline is Jesus and John, homosexual lovers, ? And then underneath the picture was, you know, State Representative Karen Mann, something. Yeah. It made it look as though I was the one that was saying it in the first place. And gosh, I mean, it was so shocking to me that somebody at that committee was so vindictive that they would take that immediately to the newspapers after the meeting. So that by the next morning it was already being published. Because their whole thing is to cow you into humility and obedience, right? Shut your mouth. Absolutely. You don't have a right to talk about these things. But you did. I mean, I don't know exactly how much good it did. What I finally decided that I had to do was alert the parents to the problem. So I did a statewide speaking tour. And I went to as many small communities as I could, gave talks and showed the problem and encouraged people to start either homeschooling or start private schools. And I think that the homeschooling community in Iowa certainly grew from that. I mean, I hope it has made a difference. Because there's not much we can do. There's not much we can do to rescue the public schools anymore. Where things went wrong in Iowa, and this may be a warning for anybody else who's watching from America. I don't know. I don't know how things work in England, but in the old days, the local school board was the one that was more in control of the curriculum. And the parents had a lot of influence with the local school board because these were people that they knew and they could vote for them every year, vote them in or out. But when the federal money started getting involved, you know, the Federal Department of Education, I think, came in 76 or 78, something like that.
Yeah.
And the federal money started coming in. It went first. I mean, Iowa is kind of the showcase state for some reason, because I guess if it will fly in Iowa, it will fly anywhere, because Iowa's right in the middle. It's a very small agricultural state.
Right.
And they set up 15 federal areas in the state of Iowa and broke everything up into these federal area education agencies. Funnel the money in there, and then the curriculum comes in through that area and is kind of foisted off on the local communities. So the local school board has no power anymore. And I think that is the way that they kind of got control of the schools. And it's not necessarily the teachers. It's not that teachers are bad people. It's that the entire educational situation in the universities is pushing these things on the kids who are learning to be teachers as though this is what's normal.
Yeah.
And then the money is flowing in that way and supporting this curriculum that's normal.
Yeah.
And then everything is normalized, and then we're all desensitized.
Yeah.
And then we accept it because we're ready to knuckle under and pretend to be a sponge on the floor, you know?
Yeah, I think you've hit on it there, definitely. And I think it takes somebody with, it's funny because I was talking to Paula, Dr. Paula, as you said, a mutual friend of ours, who was saying in school, sometimes it's those kids that were a bit rebellious and a bit naughty and didn't get on well at school that turn out to be the ones that don't take any nonsense when they're older. And I know you didn't have an easy time at school, but to see some good come from that is your strength of character. And it does take people, and there are a lot of people who I do think are recognizing some of what you're talking about and don't like it and will begin to stand up against it, and already are doing. But as I said, thank God you did, and it can't have been easy.
Well, but here's the part that scares me. We're talking 1980, and here we are in 2022, and I don't see that anything has changed for the better. I just see that it's a lot worse.
Yeah, and it's all presented like the problem with it is that if you don't say that you agree with these certain ideologies or such, you're a bigot. You're just not a very decent person, and you're not a kind person. And who wouldn't agree with this? It's a strange sort of hypnosis that we have come to accept things that are, if you just take a step back, are not. It's hard to know how we've got here, but it's interesting to hear you talk about the beginnings of this, that this hasn't just arrived, that it was embryonic in the 70s, and it's the result of those early beginnings.
Well, I wonder, I mean, this is probably a stupid thought, but I really wonder how much of it's connected to 1964 in the United States, when the Supreme Court disallowed prayer in the schools. Because up to that point, every morning, I mean, I'm old enough to remember starting every morning, the teacher would, through the loudspeaker, would pray with the students. Now, I'm not saying it was some great spiritual experience, but what it was the administration acknowledging that there is a higher power, that there is somebody who's in control and who's good, and that we can learn from him. It was at least that much of an acknowledgement. And then in 1964, they said, no, that's dangerous, that's illegal, and that's hurting the atheist kids. And I didn't know any I mean, I didn't know anything about religion or faith, but I would never have called myself an atheist. And I didn't know any atheist kids in my school. And yet our whole school lost that moment of prayer in the morning. And things seemed to change pretty rapidly after that, because up to that point, there were some sort of dress codes at school. You had to dress a certain way. By 1967, when I was getting some teacher training classes at the university, the people that were coming back from doing their internship at the schools said, especially the men, they said, we just can't teach. These girls are wearing skirts that are so short that you can see everything. And then they sit in the front row and they put their feet up on the desk so that you're looking right down between their legs. And then I'm supposed to teach in that environment. That's how fast things change. In 3 years, we went from dress code, pretty civil behavior, respect for teachers, to 1967, where it's just all out war against any sort of decency, I guess you would say. I mean, that's an old-fashioned word, but.
Yeah, and to say, well, we get rid of God, we've got this values clarification, but it's always someone's values, though, isn't it? The question is whose, because the idea that we should be free and not wear a uniform and be relaxed and, you know, lie on the ground and pretend you're a sponge and a tree that's someone's values. It's not valueless. So you get rid of God, and who are you serving? Whose values are you serving?
Yeah.
It's frightening.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to Jordan Peterson always talking about how Nietzsche's idea was that we could somehow develop our own values. Now that God is dead, we could develop our, but you can't. No. You just can't develop your own values, because there has to be some substrate to that. There has to be some history. There has to be some sort of underlying support.
Yeah.
You just can't. Everybody can't have their own values. Then there's no body of truth or community or being able to work together. It's like saying everybody can have their own law of physics, you know?
Yeah, there's no ground. And it's that will to power, isn't it? That you may all have your own values, but whoever can coalesce and have the most, then they'll dominate. If there's no ultimate truth, then gosh. Yeah. Well, Karen, we've
you opened up a can of worms.
I've opened up a can of worms, and we've gone through veered into education. We were on your family story. So I don't know how you are feeling about time. I think we've been going for about an hour and possibly just about an hour and 20 minutes. Now, if you'd like to carry on, I'm happy to. If you want to say that we veered off and we'll have a part 2 and get into your missionary work and into your channel, then I'm very happy to do either, but I want to hear your full story. What would you
like? I'm happy to do a part 2 if you want.
Yeah, I would
whatever
really
you think works.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more. I don't want to take up any more of your time today, but let's schedule that, shall we, Karen, and hear a part 2.
I do want to clarify one thing. I know that there are well, let's just leave it at that. Yeah, some things are just too hard to talk about, aren't they?
I mean, I'm not rushing you off, Karen. If you want to talk further.
No, I completely understand. I'm trying to find a way to clarify the issue about yes, somebody has the values. Now, that doesn't mean that I do think that people have to have the freedom to think and to speak and to whatever their situation is, that they don't, everybody doesn't, I'm not saying everybody has to hunker down and believe the same thing, right? That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that I don't think it's right for some people who get control of the environment, or who get control of the media, or who get control of the education system, should then be able to take their set of values and cram them down everybody else's throat.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where my problem arises. Even in the issue of the whole gay situation, I'm not telling anybody else what to do. I just don't think that the people who believe that way should be able to turn around and cram that down everybody else's throat and say, we all have to line up and accept all of this as something to celebrate.
Yeah.
That's where my problem comes in. And I think that's very hard to talk about, because you run into problems on both sides. And there are people who are much better able, much more articulate about it, that can talk about it than I can. But I didn't want to leave it with some idea that I think that I'm saying that everybody should line up with the Christian perspective, because that's not what I'm saying at all.
Yeah.
Right? Because
I know what you're saying. Yeah.
That never works. I mean, that was the whole thing back with Constantine, was he's trying to get everybody to line up and say, okay, now we're all Christians. Well, but that's not true. That's not true faith. Faith has to come from each individual person having their individual experience with God.
Yeah.
And if somebody else tells you what to believe, all you're going to get is rebellion, you know?
Yeah. It's not about,
do not, like it says in Colossians, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. This has no power over the flesh at all. So having somebody else make up a bunch of rules that we should all follow, whether they're progressive rules or conservative rules, isn't helpful.
No, I know exactly what you're saying. And I think it's not about an imposition of rules. It's not, you all have to be Christian, but what I think is important is that we search for truth together, and we are reasonable and logical about it. And sometimes I think we can say, well, what works? You know, if we did this, or if we lived in this way, what does the end of that look like? And if we lived in this way, what does the end of this look like? But if we're just concentrating on living for the moment and the experience of the moment, then I think we lose that end. And so it's not about being a Christian or any particular religious faith, but I do think it's important, because we're educating human beings. We're not educating dogs and cats, to say, well, when we teach a young person, what is the purpose of what we're doing? What should they become? Or what does it mean to be a human? So I agree with you. I didn't get for a minute that you were saying we should all impose Christianity on everyone. But at the same time, I think it's worth having a conversation about what the things that we're teaching the kids, what is the ultimate aim? What is the ultimate end? And is that good for their flourishing, for human flourishing? Or is it just good for human feeling? And if we say, well, it's just good for human feeling, then why prioritize that? What values, where does that come from? You know?
Well, you were talking to Paula Boddington the other day, and she's talking about utilitarianism. And the whole idea of utilitarianism is to as much as possible diminish pain and increase pleasure. Which, I mean, doesn't that sound great? That sounds great. Then we'd all be flourishing. But
masters, yeah.
But it doesn't actually work out that way. And I'm still on Twitter, primarily because I only follow a certain group of people that are very controlled in their behavior, and I only allow replies from people that I follow. So I get an opportunity to listen to a lot of great thinkers. But the other day, one of these great thinkers posted something that someone else had said and made a reply to it. And what this other person had said was that if we really want to diminish suffering in the world, you should be pro-abortion, because that's the best way to diminish suffering, because, you know, so many women suffer with difficult pregnancies, or they don't have enough money for their pregnancy, or, you know, their family's having problems, or they have too many children. And so we really want to diminish suffering. We should be pro-abortion. Whole bunch of people pile on and say, yeah, that's the best way to diminish suffering. But this guy had made the comment, well, you know, what you're doing is setting, if your goal is to diminish suffering, you're setting up a world in which somebody's values are going to determine what suffering is and what suffering isn't. And I mean, of course, my immediate thought was, well, and it's also who's suffering, because
right, exactly,
the baby suffers in every instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and I think in the abortion debate, which is very difficult to navigate, people always go to the limit cases, and the truth is that by far the vast number of people seeking abortion are for reasons of inconvenience, and they are not because of you know, severe disability or cases of rape. And these are always used to point to how we must help alleviate women's suffering. The truth of it is, and that is, those are desperate situations, you know, but they do not make up the majority of abortions. So
before we leave the Paula Boddington thing too, I do want to say, I thought when you guys were talking about this, that you forgot one thing to bring up. I mean, probably it's in the back of your mind, but all this stuff about relieving women's suffering by having artificial wombs and all of that, as though the ultimate value is that women shouldn't suffer at all.
Yeah.
But wait a minute, I thought women wanted to be like men. So
right.
Men suffer a lot, you know.
Yeah.
There's been times my husband has had to crawl under our house through the crawl space where the rats and the snakes and everything else are, because he has to fix something with the heating system or the plumbing, or we have to hire somebody to come and climb up on the roof of the house. And, you know, men suffer a lot in what they do in their work. And
yeah, sure.
So are we going to eliminate all suffering for them too? Then what does the world look like?
I know, but this is what's interesting about that whole discussion about equality, as when you understand equality as sameness, you know. And Jordan Peterson talks about this again, that you don't see women calling for equal numbers of women in scaffolding or in prisons or in low paid heavy labor. You're calling for more women CEOs, more women running countries. But the truth is, there are many men, as you say, who are in difficult situations, facing you know, very difficult work. And if we really want equality, let's level it up there, shall we? Let's get 50% female scaffolders and builders.
I'd rather be a woman.
Yeah, but I mean, even just saying what a woman is, you know, this idea of equality, I find really difficult of just trying to make everything equal outcome, equity, this equal outcome. I remember having a conversation with one of my colleagues, and she said, well, of course there should be 50% women MPs, female MPs. There's half the country are women. And there was no sort of thought about what I thought, what does that even mean? Like, what if they don't want to be? That's just one thing. And what, it just didn't make any sense to me that you would just demand this 50%. You know.
Well, then what, I don't know how the numbers break down, but maybe 30% of the country is children, 30% is adults, and 30% is aged people. Then do we also break up the MPs that way? You have to have 30% children MPs, 30% adults, 30% old people. I mean, it depends on how you're going to parse things. If you're going to try to say we have to have equal representation, you can parse that any number of ways. And it gets ludicrous pretty fast because we're living in an incoherent world, right?
Yeah. That actually, you talked about not imposing your religion. But the irony, of course, is that these ideas, these ideologies about equity and these sexualizing children and stuff, these are being pushed with religious fervor And actually the religious people are being oppressed by this sort of fervor to these liberal ideologies. So, you know, the very criticisms that are made about religious people are being made to, you know, by these others towards the religious groups. I mean, somebody said to me recently, you don't know what it's like when you're LGBT, you face discrimination every single day and prejudice every single day. And I have no doubt that people do face discrimination and prejudice. But the truth is, I, as a faithful Catholic person trying to live authentically my faith, have faced and encounter discrimination, prejudice, criticism, abuse very often, I would say, far more often than is reasonable. So yeah, it's just interesting.
Yeah, obviously we have more to talk about, so.
We do, don't we? Karen, thank you so much for coming on to chat with me, and let's schedule a part 2 and hear about your work, your missionary work, and getting your channel started. But
well, I'm really excited that you have a channel, Catherine, and thank you so much for giving me the incredible opportunity to be here with you. And I really love to hear you talk more, because I get tired of my own voice. But that's sort of the nature of telling a story, isn't it?
Yeah. So no, I think it's been really, I've loved hearing it, and I'm sure anyone watching will love to hear it as well. And share it on your own channel too, because I'm sure your listeners and viewers.
Yes. Would you be able to send me an MP4 of it?
Yeah.
After you, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I'll stop this now. Thanks, Karen. Bye.
Bye.